As I mentioned in the introduction, my name's Rachael Levy, and I'm from the University of Sheffield. But I've actually was born and brought up in Dumfries, which is just, well, compared to Sheffield, it feels like it's just down the road. We came to Edinburgh a lot as a child, so it's been really lovely coming back. In fact, it's been really quite nostalgic. But to tie in with this as well, it also made me think a lot about sort of childhood. And apart from coming to Edinburgh a lot as a child, I was also read to a lot as a child. But in the context of my own research, what I now find quite interesting in reflection was that at the time, my mum was not a reader. So my mum tended to read to me a lot, but didn't read for herself. And as I've become more interested in the motivations for shared reading and the influences, I now look back on that, and it's been one of the things that I've been quite interested in understanding from the point of view of my own research. So what I'm going to do now is just tell you a little bit about a project that we've been involved in about trying to understand some of the motivators and also the barriers to shared reading in families. Which, and as I said, this project is just about to come to an end. So I'm going to try and cram in as much as I can into 15 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to start off by telling you something that you know already, and that is it's good to read with young children. We know that. We know that children who read regularly before they enter school are more likely to learn language faster. Shared reading facilitates more kind of complex talk, so the kind of things that you'll be doing in the context of shared reading are really valuable. But it's also that opportunity to be close to your child, those issues of being in close proximity and that kind of interaction. We also know that there have been a number of reading interventions. Obviously, I'm aware of lots of wonderful things that's been sort of happening here, just to try and encourage families to read with their children. Some of these interventions are focused on things like the quality of the reading, but others, things like, I don't know whether you are aware of things like the book bath bed, which was run by Jo Frost, the super nanny, naughty step, all that kind of thing. And I don't know about you, but I think I would find it quite patronising if I had Jo Frost telling me, to read at this time and to read like this and to do it like this and put your child on the naughty step or whatever. So there are some of these reading interventions, I think, have not been so successful. And for that reason, really, when I've been thinking about, reading intervention, rather than trying to think about, a reading intervention and something that, that we have and that we do to families, my study has been very much about trying to understand families, to start with a family and understand what happens. And what I was really surprised about when I first started doing this project was that we know very, very little. We have very little qualitative data about what happens in families. What do families do in terms of shared reading? And actually to take that data and to allow that to help us to inform the reading interventions. So the kind of questions that are at the heart of my study: to explore shared reading practices and the barriers to these, to investigate how shared reading fits or doesn't fit within the context of everyday family life, but also crucially to make sure that this study was carried out in a sample that was socially and culturally mixed. We know that lots of middle-class families do read with their children. It was to understand how many different families, whether they do, whether they don't, and if they don't, why not, and those kind of questions. I should just say that this study was part of a much bigger project. There was 8 different studies in the whole project. And the whole project was focused on trying to understand how shared reading does promote language development. But I'm obviously just talking about my own study within this. So this study was with 29 families. Everybody had a preschool child around about the age of 3 to 4. We spoke to families in low-income areas in Sheffield and also in Liverpool. Recruitment was through nurseries, toddler groups, that kind of thing. But one of the aims of the study was to, because we were working quite closely with the reader organisation, some of you might be aware of, is to actually help to inform kind of intervention in that respect. So the interviews themselves were very much about, like I say, understanding. I think that is the key word here, about understanding these families. So to be honest, when we went in and we started talking to families, we didn't even mention the word reading for about the first kind of half an hour, 45 minutes. It was, just talk me through a day. What do you do with your child? And just try to kind of understand how reading did or did not fit into the context of everyday family life, and understanding those kind of home practices. So essentially, there were three kind of main findings, and I'm just going to try and just touch on each of these in the time that we have. One of them pertaining to the role of enjoyment and feedback, which is obviously very important for this day today. The other one, like I say, was the link, because what I was very interested in was that, this link between parents' own relationships with reading and their own kind of reading activities with their children. And finally, this kind of whole concept about reading being an everyday family practice, or fitting in to the everydayness of family practice. So I'm just going to try and give you a little flavour of each of these kind of main areas. So to start, again, it sounds quite self-evident that if parents were going to do it, they had to be enjoying it. Now, it sounds really obvious, but in actual fact, it is really quite critical, because what we also found was that it wasn't just a case of enjoying reading with their child, but they had to be getting something back from it. So that concept of feedback was critical. But just the kind of things that parents were saying to us, it was like a comfort thing for me. I enjoyed it, it was nice. I've got this baby of my own, I'm going to read to her. I enjoy reading for her, it's not that I'm forced. And this was something that came up time and time again, that it wasn't, if they didn't want to do it, they wouldn't do it, but they did it because they enjoyed it. So getting the enjoyment right was absolutely critical. Like in this quote here, if I'm not going to enjoy it, I'm not going to give 100%, she's not going to enjoy it. So what's the point? She probably would notice you have to be into it. So again, this over and over again, you've got to be into it. It's got to be something that they want to do. And this linked very closely with this concept of feedback. A lot of parents talked about, the expression on their child's face. I'm happy, to get her books now, because I can see this. I can see something's going on. I can see something's going in. I can see that she's enjoying it. When he does listen, his facial expression, he's realised, he's understanding it. So that feedback was both in terms of the child enjoying it, but also the child getting something from it. That was critical in the maintenance of shared reading activity. That, of course, the flip side of that was the negative feedback. So children pushing books away, not wanting to be involved. Things like last year she cut the book. She didn't want it. Messing about with the book. You can tell he's not interested. I bring the book, she pushes it away. But critically, what a lot of these parents were talking about was very, very young children. So actually that whole kind of not being interested, not ready for reading, was something that came up time and time again. And that I thought was interesting, because it had a real impact on this whole concept of reading with babies, reading with very, very young children. Because I think for a lot of these parents, and like I say, I think there is quite a difference in terms of sociocultural discourse, but for a lot of these parents, they needed that feedback. And that kind of feedback they weren't necessarily going to get from a baby, and that meant they were far less likely to read with their babies. So that I thought was quite interesting. So a lot of this, she's too young, isn't going to get into it. So again, thinking about intervention, I think there was something quite critical there about saying, just because a child is biting a book or eating it or throwing it away, that doesn't mean they're not interested, but it's actually just being a baby. It's what babies do. So just to move on to the second sort of overarching finding. So like I say, the second thing I was particularly interested in was kind of understanding this kind of relationship between the parents' relationship with reading and the kind of reading that they did with their own children. And I have to say, this to me was one of the surprises of this study. I came into the study with the false belief that actually if you'd had very negative experiences of reading at school yourself, you were less likely to read, particularly reading aloud with your children. And actually, and I do realise, and I think it's important to say that I'm not trying to generalise at all. This was a very small sample, but within this sample, all these parents did read with their children. So what we essentially found, because again, I used a little categorisation here, not to try and do anything terribly sort of quantitative, but just to kind of help me to look at the data and understand a particular group. So essentially, I was sort of did like a cross analysis. So roughly 2/3 of the parents would have fallen into the category of did read themselves and did go on to read with their children. But roughly 1/3 were very much in the category of did not read as a child or hated reading at school. A lot of them talked very much about having quite negative experiences at school, being made to read aloud, but did go on to have very positive reading relationships with their children. So that's what I just want to focus on, was this group here who didn't really have this strong relationship as with reading themselves, but did go on to have this relationship with their own children. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples from the data. So this is Natalie, 28-year-old single mother, lives with her 2 sons, 3 and 8, currently at home full-time, but plans to return to her job as a classroom assistant when her youngest starts school. So the kind of things she said to us in terms of her own reading, well, I never read when I was younger, ever. I don't think it interested me. I've got certain memories in English where I couldn't read certain words, and I used to have to ask the teacher, and obviously you don't want to ask the teacher in front of kids. We had a lot of this, you know, about that kind of fear of being made to read aloud, or obviously were made to read aloud in school. And then talking to Natalie about her own reading now, well, no, I'm not a reader really. I read autobiographies. I think that in itself is interesting, that reading autobiographies and her mind is not classed as being a reader. So it's that thing about fiction again. Anyway, but I don't really sit and read. I wouldn't go out and purposefully buy a book. But when it came to 5 minutes, right? When it came to so reading with her own child, talked very much about, you know, as our bonding time, that time together. It goes off books. Just because we've got books in our hand, we talk about the rest of the day. So we started to understand that for many of these parents, reading was a very, very different thing. Reading with a child was a very different animal to the kind of reading that they've been doing themselves as a child. It was about talking. It wasn't just about reading. Just because the book's there, you know, we talk about the day, we do this, we do the next thing. I enjoy reading more now with the kids because I'm excited to do different things with them. I'm learning about new authors. It wasn't, like it wasn't something that I was that interested in. So now I look at stories, I'm looking for more books that authors wrote that he might enjoy. I never used to do that. I just used to get books that look good on the cover. So again, I haven't got time to go into this in detail, but actually a lot of these parents actually were developing their own relationship with reading through the context of their shared reading with their children. Kylie, let's just move on to the data. Again, am I okay? Right. Okay, good. Okay, so Kylie, own reading as a child. Well, Mum never sat and read with us. I can remember reading out in class. I wasn't confident, again, those same themes coming through again. Wasn't confident around them. I'm still not, don't enjoy reading. Not out loud, but kids' books are fine. And again, that was quite interesting. I don't enjoy it, but actually she has discovered that reading through children's books is okay. Talking about her own reading, a very similar story, not a reader, and she said things like, you know, when people go on holiday and get into a book, I just can't do that. I just can't get into one. I think it's from not reading when I was younger. Now again with Kylie, fascinating really how her own relationship with reading had developed. Again, what we've just heard from her is how hard reading was, not confident, didn't enjoy it. But the word that she kept using in terms of reading with her child was easy. It's so easy to read with him. I love reading with him, love doing things like that. I think it's one of the easiest things you can do because you can sit and read for half an hour or 5 minutes. It's just something you can fit in. There's no cleaning afterwards, just put the book back, get on with it. You can do it while the tea's being cooked. So again, that kind of discovery that actually it's not difficult and it fits in to family life. We do just because his books are out, he'll go and get them. When they want to read, you can't say no. And again, that was a very familiar pattern that actually it was very child-led. If the children want to do it, they will do it. And that was what motivated parents to read with their children, was because their children wanted to do it. And then Hardra, who early 30s, lived with her husband, no formal educations, and married when they were both 16. Again, used to struggle a lot with reading in school, didn't read with parents, but Hardra, interestingly, got into reading later. So she did enjoy reading later, to the point that she described her own reading now as being out of control. So she was somebody who sort of got into it and was like, God, I've got to do the dishes, I've got things to do, but I just can't put this book down. So that was interesting. Perhaps not surprisingly, she had developed a very strong reading relationship with her child. Talks about her child loving books, bedtime stories happen. But what was very interesting about this family was actually it wasn't necessarily Hadra that did the reading, but actually it was her husband, and her husband was not a reader. So again, the same kind of thing had happened. So she would talk about her husband taking the little girl up to bed at night, so he gets her changed, reads her a book, just tells her some stories, asks her about her day. So they talk, I wouldn't say rubbish, they talk randomly, and then he'll tell her a story, and I take her up to bed. So again, we're getting the same thing back, that reading is not just about the book. It's about talking, chatting, spending time together. It's a very, very different sort of conception altogether. So just to summarise a little bit of that, adults who reported that they were not readers in this sample did still go on to have enjoyable shared reading relationships with their children. But what I was finding was that actual experience of reading, that definition of reading, was very, very different to the kind of reading that they had been doing themselves as a child. It was not necessarily about reading. I put that deliberately in scare quotes, really, because I'm talking about decoding, deconstructing. It was not necessarily about that. And for many families, it was just embedded in the everydayness of family practice. So just for the last slide, a couple of slides, just to come on to that final kind of finding, was that for these families, part of the reason why it fitted, and they did seem to do it, was because it just worked as part of everyday life. It's our bonding time. It goes off books, just because the book's there, but we talk about our day. It's their time. When it's the easiest thing to do, that was Kylie, you can do it when the tea's being cooked. Just try to build it into our day, rather than actually learning to read. So it wasn't about the school discourse of reading, it was about everydayness of family life. We incorporate it into a routine. And again, this is where if we didn't have books, nobody would sleep. You know, this is where the quote came from, that it was just part of everyday life. It's what we've come to do. And in actual fact, in some of the data, we also got this kind of message coming across that for some families, reading signified that they were doing family. You know, so in this case, the last quote here, that, you know, she had got a new partner, and the partner read to the child, and she was very happy about that, because that signified that they were a family doing family things. That was all part of reading. So something that was much bigger, much messier, much more complex, really, than sitting down and literally reading a book. So, conclusion. How have I tried to put all this together? 3 years, 15 minutes. Okay, so rather than intervention encouraging families to do shared reading, I would argue very strongly that we need to firstly understand how shared reading is part of doing family. And this is where we need to begin from. Recognise that for many families, shared reading is a very different experience from their own reading. And again, thinking about intervention, I think this is something that we need to encourage parents to do. Need to encourage parents to find ways of enjoying shared reading. That enjoyment is valuable. And what I worry about a little bit is that when children start school, that school discourse kicks in about this is reading now, getting it right, decoding, getting, you know, through the reading schemes. But actually to continue to say to parents, just keep doing that, just keep doing what you're doing, that is valuable. Valuing shared reading as an enjoyable activity, and just carry on or begin reading in ways that suit you and your child. Thank you.